This is Chapter 2, Section 1. Chapter 2 as a whole is called Origins of American Government. So it's going to be very much focused on kind of the history and the formation of our government. Section 1 is specifically called, what is it specifically called? Our Political Beginnings. I'm sorry I don't have a slide for that intro, but it is Our Political Beginnings. So we've got several key terms, and Section 1 is kind of the build-up. I like the other sections in the chapter better, but we'll get through this and it will lead into the colonial period of America. So first term we have there is due process, and it's protection against unjust taking of life, liberty, or property. So it's a term we use in the court system. You hear in the news today as well. And we'll go through each one of these terms and put them in context when we get to them within the actual content of the slide. Then we have two documents that we're going to look at. They're the Petition of Right, which was signed in 1628 and required the English king to obey the law of the land and increase the influence of Parliament. So obviously that is something that applied to England, which has connections to the United States because the English are who settled the colonies in what became the United States. Then we have the English Bill of Rights. It was signed in 1689 that required free elections and guaranteed many basic rights, such as due process and trial by jury, to all English citizens. So again, you're going to see some of the same themes reoccurring in these documents, and you'll also see those themes that take place in American documents when we get to them. And I kind of laid this out, but as the English colonies came to the New World, or what was the New World to them, they brought with them political ideas that had developed over hundreds of years in England, but many of those things had developed in other places before England. And so some of the ideas like the rule of law, which we'll talk about more here when we get to one of our documents, have roots in early Asian and African civilizations. Other influence came from the ancient Romans because they had controlled territory in England. And then these ideas were just put to paper in these landmark English documents. So we can kind of trace the roots directly to those landmark English documents. And so with them came the key political concepts of ordered, limited, and representative government. And so we still have these today. And I think just if you look at the heading of them, you can figure out what they are. But the idea of ordered government is that their government should be divided into subunits and ruled by officers according to law. So you have a structure and order in place that dictates your government. So if you look at like the United States today, we have a federal government whose capital is in Washington, D.C. Then that's the country itself is broken down into 50 states, and each one of those 50 states has a capital as well. So you can see the order and structure. You can go even further. In the city, we have the city government. We've got leaders within the city. And you could even get specific and call, kind of our school a type of government. We have the superintendent who looks over the entire district. We have the different schools that each have their own principals and vice principals, and you've got classrooms who have teachers. And so there's this idea of structure and order that exists. The second bullet up there is the idea of limited government. And so the goal of this government is to provide safety and security for the citizens without infringing upon their rights or limiting the amount with which their rights are infringed upon. Ultimately, the idea is there are limits on the government's power. I know I'm moving quickly and speaking quickly. Again, you can pause, rewind if you're watching this on your own time. And then the third one up there we've actually mentioned already, the idea of representative government, that the government should serve the will of the people. And so the people should have a say in what the government does or does not do. And so these are all ideas that we have identified in England that made their way to the colonies. So Looking at where these ideas were planted, we have these landmark English documents. And so the first one we will look at is called the Magna Carta. It was written in 1215. So we're talking over 800 years ago, 805 years ago. And it was created by the English barons. And I think the activity you're going to do this week actually will detail the story behind the Magna Carta with a little bit more depth. But basically the barons were a noble class who had some degree of influence, but they forced the king to sign this document and limited the power of the king, which was the first time that this had been done. And so it guaranteed certain rights for the privileged at this point. So we're not even talking these rights weren't guaranteed to everyone, but to the privileged, taking some power away from the king. So you had the ideal trial by jury, due process of law, and then eventually these rights were extended to all people. You get to miss the video clip because we're virtual. Second document we'll look at is the Petition of Right, and this was signed in 1628. So again, dates aren't super important, but I do think you need to know chronology and general time frames. So we've got Magna Carta in 1215. We have the Petition of Right in 1628, and it was signed by King Charles I. In that 400-year period, some of the kings followed the Magna Carta, some didn't. And so some of these points in the Petition of Right were reiterating points present in the Magna Carta. But the Petition of Right banned the king from imprisoning or punishing people without first following laws of the land. And so I always kind of think of this idea of like the cartoon character Queen, like in Alice in Wonderland is what I'm thinking of, where, she's shouting off with their head for really no reason at all. That's based in some degree of reality. And so the Petition of Right was aimed at fixing that, and so that there needed to be a process before punishments were handed out to citizens. It also kept the king from declaring military rule in times of peace or making people house their soldiers. There are some ideas present there that apply directly to things that made it into the US Constitution that we'll talk about in a few weeks. And then it also required the consent of Parliament for taxation. So the king couldn't decide by themselves to raise taxes. Parliament had to consent to it as well. And so that was passed in declared in 1628 with the Petition of Right. The third document, English document we'll look at, is the English Bill of Rights. It was drawn up by Parliament in 1689. So we've got Magna Carta 1215, the Petition of Right in 1628. And about 60 years after that, we have the English Bill of Rights. And again, it was designed to prevent abuse of power by the monarchs. So it required the consent of Parliament for taxation and the suspension of laws, promised the right to a fair trial, and to petition the monarchy to correct injustices. Now, this one has a lot of similarities between the Petition of Right, and part of that is because in the 1600s, in between these two documents, you actually had a civil war take place within England, and so this was kind of a rebirth for England with the English Bill of Rights. One final document that I did throw in here because it's not present in your textbook, but does occasionally appear on the EOC is the Mayflower Compact. And when we go back in person, we might do an activity with this, a quick reading. I didn't do it just because I had to pick and choose with us being virtual. But essentially, as the Pilgrims were coming over from England, they set up and they signed this document that became known as the Mayflower Compact, which set up some degree of self-government and majority rule, so the idea of people voting. And this was obviously the first in the America because this is when the colonists are arriving. So the Mayflower Compact of 1620 is another one that I've thrown in there that I want you to be aware of because it could appear on the EOC. And so we see some of those events taking place. We've got the Magna Carta in 1215. Also in the 1200s, you have the first elected parliament, again, limiting the power of the monarch. You've got the English Civil War that I referenced taking place in the 1600s, and then the English Bill of Rights in 1689. And so you can see that all laid out there. This chart was within your book. I think it's on page 34. Let me look at the book in front of me, 32. And it does a good job of laying out, if you look at it here, with each document is passed, what rights that document contained. And so you can see there's a lot of overlap. It contains the Magna Carta and English Bill of Rights, which we just discussed. And then it throws in the English Bill of Rights and the Bill of Rights for the United States. We will obviously talk about each one of those, but you can see how they're building upon each other, trying to limit the power of the government, provide more order and structure, and you can see how that ties in directly to with what we have today. Okay, so normally this would be it with the notes, but this would be day 2. We're getting them all done at once. So you've got several more vocabulary terms. Again, we'll put each one of these in context within the notes, but you've got a charter, which is a written grant of authority from the king. So it's like a contract. You have bicameral. So bi means 2, cameral means houses. So bicameral is 2 houses, is in a 2-house legislature. You have proprietary, and this was a name given to a specific type of colonies. So when the 13 colonies were settled in the United States, there are different types. Proprietary is one of those. And so it was the name given to the ones organized and governed according to the will of a proprietor, kind of a business person who was granted land by the king. Then we have unicameral, which is, again, una is 1, cameral is house, so 1 house legislature, and those bicameral and unicameral we'll use throughout the semester, so you do need to be familiar with them, and maybe right now you're already thinking of some examples of at least a bicameral legislature. So it's not like when the Pilgrims came to America that all 13 colonies were immediately established. They were established over a period of 125 years, with the first one being founded in Virginia in 1607. If you know the Disney movie Pocahontas, that depicts the general events. Obviously, they use some creative license with it, but the general idea is they're founded in 1607, with Georgia being the last of the 13 colonies settled in 1733. The colonies as a whole were similar, but we are going to focus on the differences, but ultimately they were very similar in nature. We're going to focus specifically on the differences in how their governments were run and established. But each colony was established on the basis of a charter granted by the king. So the king gave this contract saying, you, as a colony of Great Britain, can go settle in the Americas. And again, it's important to understand that these colonies were still part of England at this point. And so the charters granted some governing authority to the colonies, but kept most of it for the king. And we'll highlight that with each one of the different types. So the 3 different types we see listed there, the royal, proprietary, and charter, and we've got brief descriptions of them. So the royal colonies are directly controlled by the king. The proprietary colonies are run by a proprietor chosen by the king. And then the charter colonies do have a little bit more freedom. They're mainly run by elected legislatures, and again, they're the most independent. You can see this map here highlights that. So you've got the royal colonies in green, the proprietary colonies in yellow or gold, and then the charter colonies in purple. And you can see which one there are more of. And this was as of 1775. When these colonies existed, and hopefully that date 1776 or that year sticks up in your head just a little bit, and we'll talk more about those events soon. So focusing just on the royal colonies. The governor of the royal colonies was appointed by the king, so you have a direct connection to England. You had a bicameral legislature, so you had 2 houses. The upper house was also appointed by the king, and that upper house served as the highest court system. So we've got a legislature, so legislative power, legislative branch. We also have the judicial branch or judicial power within it. The governor would be the executive. The lower house, so the less important of the houses, but the second house in the bicameral legislature was elected by the colonists who owned enough property to vote. So the legislature would get to create the laws, but the governor had to approve all of the laws, and then the governor was appointed by the king. So again, you can see all roads kind of point back to the king controlling these royal colonies. The proprietary colonies were run by a proprietor, kind of like a business person. They would establish, they would be given this land grant, oftentimes for some type of religious freedom, but in many cases there was a business aspect to it as well. And the proprietor was actually able to appoint the governor. So one step further away from the king. The colonies were run much like the royal colonies in structure. The exception to that is Pennsylvania. It was more democratic, so more safe from the colonists, and it did have a unicameral legislature, so just one house. Lastly, the charter colonies. The governors in the charter colonies were elected by property-owning colonists. So the citizens within the colonies picked the governor, and again, we put citizens very limited. You're talking white male property owners, and they lacked the veto power. Veto power is the ability to stop legislation that one of the houses passed. We'll talk about that power more when we talk about the United States Congress and the president. They were able to elect a bicameral legislature who could pass laws without the approval of the king. So again, they're electing their governor, they're electing their legislature, both houses of their legislature, and that legislature can pass laws without the king. So charter colonies, we can tell very clearly, are the most free of the three different types of colonies that were established in the Americas. Judges were appointed by the legislature, so people elected the legislature, and then the legislature picked the judges. There were a couple of colonies that started off as charter, Virginia and Massachusetts, and then their charters were revoked or taken back, and they were forced to become royal colonies because the king did not like how much freedom that they had. It's probably not a coincidence then that when America started to fight back in Britain, Massachusetts is kind of the heartbeat of that, and Virginia plays an important role as well, probably in large part because at one point they had quite a bit of freedom that was then taken away from them. As I've already highlighted, the charter colonies enjoyed the most freedoms. Your textbook points out the idea that had all the colonies been charter colonies, they may not have broken away because there may not have been reason to. They would have had the freedoms that they wanted. But because the other colonies were so oppressed and held down, that played a big role in them desiring to break free from England. So that is it with this week's notes.